If I'd refused that request, my life would have stayed normal, and maybe someone would still be alive. I've been repeating that sentence in my head for years, like it could somehow change what came next. It can't. It never has. And maybe that's why it took me so long to tell this story. Because saying it out loud means admitting it all started with a choice I thought was too small to be dangerous. Back then, it felt like nothing more than a strange, unusual invitation, the kind that shows up when you're tired of your own routine, when life starts to feel too tight, and any detour sounds like a chance to start over. I wasn't looking for mystery or fame or answers to things that don't make sense. I was just trying to keep moving. But that request came at the exact moment I was vulnerable enough not to say no. They told me I had the right profile, that I was discreet, careful, that I knew how to observe without getting in the way. They used words like study, analysis, documentation. None of it sounded dangerous. None of it sounded permanent. Only now do I understand that some decisions don't warn you when they're about to send you the bill. Saying yes meant stepping into a silent agreement. An agreement that wasn't signed, but it existed. It meant holding back information, changing answers, leaving out details, acting normal when something inside me already knew there was no real going back. There was a point when I realized I wasn't just observing something unusual. I was protecting a secret that didn't belong to me. And when you carry a secret like that, it starts shaping who you are, even when you're trying to pretend you're fine. I thought I was prepared. I thought all I had to do was keep an emotional distance, follow improvised protocols, trust that silence was the safest choice. But silence has consequences too. It weighs on you. It isolates you. It creates invisible cracks between you and the people around you. And that's when I started to understand that. The request wasn't really about studying anything. It was about how far I was willing to go to keep a lie alive. A lie that felt necessary. The hardest part to explain is that at first, nothing seemed wrong enough to justify regret. It was an isolated area, hard to reach, very few people, simple rules. The fewer questions I asked, the better. The less I talked, the safer I'd be. At least, that's what I believed. But the feeling of crossing a line started long before there was any concrete proof. It started when I realized I was choosing my words too carefully with the people I loved. It started when I began hiding how exhausted I was, how uneasy, how afraid. It started when I accepted that maybe it was better not to tell the whole truth. This story isn't about curiosity. It isn't about adventure. And it's definitely not about something fantastical in a comforting way. It's about guilt, about choices made in silence, about realizing too late that some things don't want to be studied, cataloged, or explained. They only want to be respected. And when that doesn't happen, someone always pays. As you're listening to me now, there's a good chance parts of this story are going to hit something you felt before, even in a different context. That feeling of agreeing to something that seemed small, of ignoring an inner warning, of thinking this won't turn into anything, and then realizing it turned into everything. That's why this story doesn't belong to one specific place or one single person. It moves through different people in different regions, living different lives, but making mistakes that look terrifyingly similar. So before I keep going, I want you to write in the comments where you're watching from. Your city, your state, your country. Not because it changes what happened to me, but because this story didn't start or end in just one dot on the map. It involves people who never met, but lived through consequences that felt the same. Where you are matters, because what happened to me might not be as far from your reality as you think. What I'm about to tell you wasn't easy to organize in my head. Some memories come back too sharp, too clear. Others come back fractured, like my brain is still trying to protect me. I don't expect everyone to believe me. I never have. I only know that after that request, nothing ever felt simple again. And what looked like a controlled study turned into something I couldn't shut off, even when I left that place. You stay with me to the end. You'll understand why I regret saying yes so much. You'll understand what was asked of me without anyone ever saying it out loud. You'll understand how something that should have been observed from a distance became a responsibility I couldn't walk away from. And more than anything, you'll understand why some stories stay buried for so long before someone finally finds the courage to speak. Because the real problem wasn't what I went out there to study. The problem was what it revealed about us. And from the moment I realized that it was already too late to just walk away. Before all of this, I was an ordinary person living a predictable, almost automatic life. I woke up early, kept schedules, handled small problems that felt bigger than they were only because they repeated every single day. My work wasn't anything extraordinary. It was technical, methodical, built on data, reports, controlled observation. I trusted logic, patterns, reasonable explanations. I've always been the kind of person who needed to see it, to accept it, to touch it, to believe it. Strange stories, forest sightings, old rumors always felt more like collective fear or imagination than anything real. My routine was quiet. I'd been living alone for a while. After a string of losses, I never really knew how to explain to anyone. Some people would have called it grief. Others would have called it a rough season. For me, it was just a constant emptiness, like something had been left behind, and I kept going anyway. Human contact faded little by little. Friends drift away when you spend too long trying to put yourself back together. Family learns not to ask when they realize certain answers never come out whole. I filled my days with repetitive tasks because it gave me a false sense of control. Control over my mind, over my memories, over everything I couldn't untangle emotionally. Deep down, I needed that rhythm. I needed to believe the world still worked in a predictable way, that everything had a cause, an effect, an explanation. It was easier that way, safer that way. I was never someone drawn to legends, folklore, or stories about unknown creatures. I always saw that kind of thing as entertainment or exaggeration, interesting to hear, but too far removed to take seriously. When someone mentioned Bigfoot, I automatically pictured poorly documented accounts, blurry photos, mistaken interpretations. To me, it lived in the same mental space as campfire. Taylor's nothing more than that. And maybe that's exactly why I was chosen. Because I didn't believe. Because I wouldn't show up expecting to find anything. Because I'd treat it like work. Now I understand that skepticism can be its own kind of blindness. It keeps you from seeing obvious signs because you're too busy trying to force everything into familiar boxes. During that period of my life, I was also dealing with money problems. Nothing dramatic enough to draw attention, but enough to keep me constantly worried. Projects that never moved forward, opportunities that never materialized, that uncomfortable feeling of being stuck while the world kept turning. When you're in that place, any invitation that promises change feels bigger than it really is. I needed to feel useful. I needed to believe I still had professional value, that my skills mattered for something beyond keeping my routine running. So when someone recognizes that, when they tell you you're the right fit, that they trust your observation, your discretion, it hits a sensitive spot. It isn't about curiosity. It's about need. I didn't talk much about myself back then. I preferred listening, watching. People open up more when they think you won't judge them. Maybe that's why I spent my whole life dealing with secrets that weren't mine. That was always my pattern, carrying things in silence. Believing I could handle it alone. Believing being strong meant not sharing. If you've ever felt out of place, tired of explaining who you are or why certain things get to you, write the word silence in the comments. I know a lot of people will understand exactly what I mean, because when silence becomes a habit, it starts to feel normal, and that's where the danger lives. Before all of this, my relationship with nature was distant, almost practical. The occasional hike, quick visits, nothing that built any real connection. The woods were just scenery, not something alive. I didn't pay attention to the sounds, the patterns, the subtle shifts. I moved through those places like I was walking down a hallway. Looking back, it feels almost naive, and I wasn't afraid. At least not that kind of fear. Not fear of the unknown, of what doesn't fit, of what watches without making a sound. My fears were different. Growing old alone, leaving nothing meaningful behind, being forgotten. Ordinary human fears, easy to ignore during the day, hard to quiet at night. When I look back now, I can see clearly that version of me needed something to break the stagnation. I needed displacement, a change of scenery, a reason to step out of autopilot. I just never imagined that change would come in the form of something that would make me question everything I thought I knew about control, rationality, and human limits. If you're listening right now and you feel like this part of the story sounds too much like your own life, comment, "I get it," because that kind of recognition matters. Not to justify bad choices, but to show how they start in the most ordinary way. No dangerous decision looks dangerous at the beginning. It looks necessary, logical, even responsible. I was an ordinary person living ordinary days, believing the world was predictable enough not to truly shock me. And it was that normalcy that left me unprepared for what came next. Because when something extraordinary happens, it doesn't choose special people. It chooses available people. And at that moment in my life, I was far too available to accept something that never should have entered my routine. And it was in that quiet availability that the invitation arrived. It didn't come directly, and it didn't come with big explanations. It was presented as something discreet, almost bureaucratic, like it was just another assignment outside my usual schedule. An initial contact, a short conversation, a few carefully chosen words. There was no over-the-top excitement, no grand promises. If anything, it was handled in a sober, controlled, almost cold way. And strangely, that reassured me. If it were truly ridiculous, I told myself it wouldn't be treated with such normal seriousness. The person who reached out didn't come across like someone tied to mysteries or wild theories. They spoke the language of caution, restraint, necessary secrecy. They said my name came up because I knew how to observe without interfering, because I wasn't impulsive, because I didn't have a history of seeking attention or exposure. In other words, because I knew how to stay quiet. It sounded like professional praise, but now I understand it was also a warning. The conditions were laid out right away before I even had any real details about what I'd be studying. An isolated area, restricted access, no official records, no photos, no video, nothing that could be shared, no public mention, no conversations outside the small circle involved. If anyone asked, the answer had to be vague. Temporary work, consulting, environmental field, data, anything that wouldn't raise suspicion. I was supposed to agree to all of that before I even knew what I was stepping into, and I agreed, because at the time, it felt like an exaggerated formality. I'd been part of confidential projects before, and there was always that kind of caution. I'd signed documents, accepted clauses, promised discretion. It all fit a familiar pattern. The difference was that this time, discretion wasn't just legal, it was moral. When I told my family I'd be gone for a while, I played it down. I said it was fieldwork, that I needed to get out of town for a bit, that the signal might be bad. I didn't lie completely, but I didn't tell the truth either. And that half-truth was the first step. Because lying rarely starts out loud. It starts with what you choose not to say. To some friends, I said I needed time to myself. To coworkers, that I was tied up with a temporary project. To myself, I said it would only be for a short stretch, and then everything would go back to normal. If you've ever used the phrase, "just for now," write it in the comments, because that phrase carries a lot of weight when you look back. The deal was simple. The fewer people who knew, the better. Not because it was illegal, but because it could spark the wrong interpretations, unwanted curiosity, outside interference. That's how they explained it. And I accepted that logic easily. I'd always believed not everything needs to be shared, that some information can do more harm than good. The problem is when that justification starts working for everything. There was one specific moment when I realized the lie had stopped being temporary. Someone close to me asked a simple, ordinary question, and I had to think before I answered. I had to build a version that sounded believable, consistent, repeatable. From that point on, I was living two narratives at the same time. The official one safe, acceptable, and the real one hidden, heavy, impossible to share. Invitation didn't just demand my physical presence. It demanded psychological commitment. It demanded that I accept seeing things without commenting, noticing patterns without recording them, feeling fear without showing it. It demanded that I trust people I barely knew and ignore the rising discomfort that came with every new rule. But I kept telling myself it was temporary, that it would end soon, that no one would get hurt. If you've ever convinced yourself a lie was necessary to protect, someone comment the word necessary, because that's how it always starts. The lie doesn't show up as something wrong. It shows up as a solution, as protection, as care. And that's exactly why it's so dangerous. As the days went on, the instructions got more specific. Certain hours, places I wasn't supposed to go, topics I wasn't supposed to mention, even among us. Silence was treated like part of the job. The less record, the less trouble. The less proof, the less risk. And I adapted with an ease that scares me now. I avoided long calls, avoided meets, avoided anything that might lead to questions. I pulled even further away from people, using the work as an excuse. And little by little, the work became the only thing I was really doing. Everything else turned into background noise. There was a constant feeling that something was being contained, held in place by an invisible thread. And I was part of that containment system, even without fully understanding what was being contained, even without knowing how far it could go. I trusted that someone knew more than I did, that someone had calculated the risks, that I was just a small piece in something bigger. But when you agree to lie, even for a reason that feels justified, you also give up part of your own judgment. You start outsourcing moral decisions. You start believing it isn't your job to question. And that's how I kept going, repeating to myself that it all had a purpose, that the limits were clear, that no, one was in real danger. If you're following this story right now, comment, "I'm here," because what comes next depends directly on that choice I made. It depends on that silent agreement. It depends on the lie I decided to carry, thinking I was protecting something, when in reality, I was only delaying an inevitable collision. At that point, I still didn't know exactly what I was going to find. No name, no image, no clear definition. Just rules, secrecy, and the certainty that once I crossed that line, I wouldn't be able to pretend nothing had happened. And I kept going anyway. Because when you've lied enough to keep something standing, quitting starts to feel more dangerous than moving forward. After I accepted the invitation and stepped into that silent agreement, I still believed I could keep everything under control as long as I stayed rational. I told myself that as long as nothing concrete happened, there was no reason to panic. That's how I started noticing the first signs, most of them too subtle to justify any immediate reaction. Small details, easy to dismiss when you really want to believe everything is normal. The first jolt didn't come from something I saw, but from what was missing. The woods, which had always felt like neutral scenery, started slipping into a kind of silence I'd never experienced. It wasn't peaceful. It was like the sound had been removed from the environment, artificially. No birds, no insects, no distant rustle. A heavy, continuous silence that made it feel like the entire space was suspended, waiting for something to happen. I tried to rationalize it. I thought about weather conditions, specific times of day, natural patterns I might not know well enough. But the longer I stayed out there, the more often that silence returned. It didn't happen all the time, which made it even stranger. It would arrive suddenly, last a few minutes, then vanish like it had never existed. It was impossible not to notice, impossible not to feel. Not long after, I started seeing marks in the ground, footprints too large to ignore, but too irregular to identify easily. I'd kneel, measure with my eyes, compare to familiar references. I tried to fit them to animals I'd studied before. Nothing matched completely. There was always something out of proportion, something that didn't make sense. Still, I kept it all in my head, avoiding any physical record, the way I'd been instructed. Objects began shifting, nothing dramatic. A branch that had blocked a trail and later showed up moved aside. Stones stacked in a way I didn't remember seeing before. Small signs of organization in places that should have been messy. It wasn't destruction. It was intervention. And that unsettled me more than simple chaos ever would have. The feeling of being watched became constant. It wasn't sudden paranoia or irrational fear. It was physical, almost instinctive. That uncomfortable awareness that makes you glance over your shoulder without knowing why. I caught myself slowing down, paying too much attention to my surroundings, choosing routes more carefully. My body reacted before my mind could accept it. If you've ever felt watched without seeing anyone, comment watching, because that kind of feeling doesn't come out of nowhere. It comes from somewhere, even if it takes us a long time to admit it. There was also the smell, something that showed up in certain spots and disappeared in others. It wasn't a normal animal smell, or rot, or vegetation. It was strong, distinct, hard to describe. An odor that stuck in your memory and made your stomach turn just slightly. I avoided lingering in those areas, but they started appearing more and more. I kept explaining things as best I could. I told myself the woods are unpredictable, that isolation can distort perception, that exhaustion changes the way you read your surroundings. And part of that was true. But there was a clear line between being tired and being alerted. And I'd crossed that line a long time ago. What disturbed me most was the repetition. The signs weren't random. They followed a pattern I couldn't decode yet. Same hours, same areas, same feeling of a boundary. Like there was an invisible border I wasn't supposed to cross, even though no one had ever explicitly told me that. Sometimes it felt like I was trespassing, not just in physical space, but in an established order. A strange sense of displacement, like my presence was being tolerated, but not welcomed. And still, I kept pushing forward, driven by the obligation I'd agreed to carry. Write the word sign in the comments if you believe not every warning comes in a clear, obvious way. Sometimes it comes scattered small fragments that only make sense when it's already too late. There was one night when the silence lasted longer than usual. I was standing still, watching an open stretch between the trees, when I realized even the wind seemed to have stopped. That's when I knew I wasn't alone. I didn't see anything. I didn't hear anything. But the certainty was absolute. Something was there. Something big enough to change the entire environment around it. My first instinct was to back away, but I held myself still. I took a slow breath, tried to stay calm, tried to remember every possible explanation. I stayed there for a few seconds that felt far too long. And when the sound returned, it was like someone had flipped an invisible switch. Everything came back at once, abruptly. That wasn't natural. I could have left right then. I could have made up any excuse. I could have ended it all before it went further. But I didn't, because admitting something was wrong meant admitting I had no control. And accepting that was more frightening than pretending everything still had an explanation. Deep down, I already knew it wasn't a normal animal. I felt it in every step, every prolonged silence, every detail out of place. But as long as I hadn't seen anything clearly, I could keep the safe story I'd built. I could keep saying it was just the woods, just isolation, just accumulated exhaustion. And it was that stubborn insistence on rationalizing the unexplainable that pushed me even farther. Because when you ignore repeated signs, they don't disappear, they intensify. And from that point on, they weren't just signs anymore. It was like something was preparing to stop being invisible. The first time I saw something truly concrete happened when I was already emotionally worn down from everything that came before. It wasn't sudden or dramatic like people usually imagine. There was no scream, no sprint, no direct confrontation. It was quiet, heavy, almost respectful. I was walking through an area I already knew, following a route I'd repeated over and over, when I felt that silence forming again, like the world around me was closing in. I stopped. Not from immediate fear, but because something inside me warned that taking another step would be a mistake. My body reacted before I could arrange the thought. That's when I sensed the presence. I didn't see a quick movement or a sudden approach. What I saw was a shape already there, integrated into the space, like it had always belonged to the landscape and had only now allowed itself to be noticed. The distance between us wasn't close, but it wasn't comfortable either. Far enough that it couldn't reach me in seconds, but close enough that I could make out details that shouldn't have been possible if it were imagination. The posture was upright, steady, with no sign of aggression, No tension like an animal about to attack. There was attention, assessment, like I was being measured, analyzed, weighed in silence. I couldn't move right away. Not because I was frozen in fear, but because any movement felt excessive. My mind tried to find familiar references, logical comparisons, but none of them worked. It didn't fit anything I'd ever studied. It wasn't an animal reacting purely on instinct. It was something aware of its own presence and of mine. The eyes were what stayed with me most, not the shape, but the intention behind them. There was no rage, no naive curiosity. It was a direct, steady gaze that cut through every attempt to rationalize. I had the unmistakable feeling I was being observed as an individual, not as an immediate threat, not as prey. It shook me in a way I still can't fully explain. If you're following this right now, comment the word presence, because presence is different from an appearance. Appearances scare you. Presences stay with you. That's when I realized I wasn't there to be attacked. If that had been the case, there would have been no hesitation, no time, no prolonged silence. What existed in that moment was a boundary being drawn, an uncomfortable mutual recognition. I was in its space, and it knew it. I kept my hands visible, breathed slowly, avoided any sudden gesture, not as a strategy I'd planned, but because everything in me knew this wasn't the moment to impose anything. I didn't try to get closer. I didn't immediately turn and run. I just stayed there, feeling the weight of that encounter settle over me. Time lost its shape. I couldn't tell you how long it lasted, seconds or minutes. What I do know is that at some point I understood the situation was being controlled by something other than me. The decision to let it continue or end it wasn't mine, and accepting that was terrifying in an entirely different way. There was a small movement, not toward me, but to the side. A calculated shift, almost like a warning. The message was clear, even without words. This space had an owner. I was there by tolerance, not by right. And that understanding brought a strange mix of relief and fear. I took a step back, then another, keeping eye contact as long as I could without seeming challenging. My heart was pounding, but my mind was oddly calm. Like all the internal noise had been replaced by absolute focus. There was no room for panic, only attention. When I finally created more distance, I realized it didn't follow me. No chase, no display of power. Just the certainty that I'd been allowed to leave, and that permission weighed more than any overt threat ever could. As I backed away, the woods slowly started to reclaim its sounds, like someone was returning the world to normal. But nothing in me went back to normal. I knew, with a clarity I didn't want to accept, that I'd crossed a point of no return. I had seen it, and I had been seen. Right? I saw something in the comments. If you believe there are experiences that completely change the way you see the world, even without violence, even without explanation. When I reached a safe spot, I had to sit down. Not from physical weakness, but because my legs didn't feel capable of carrying what had just happened. I replayed every detail in my mind, trying to find cracks, illusions, anything that could shrink it into a mistake. I couldn't. I told no one that day. Not the next day. Not in the days that followed. The necessary lie gained a new layer heavier than before. Now I wasn't just hiding information. I was hiding an experience that couldn't be shared without unpredictable consequences. What disturbed me most wasn't the size, or the potential strength, or the mystery. It was the awareness. The feeling of being assessed and deemed worthy to leave unharmed. That raised a question that has never let me go, a question that returns every time I remember that steady gaze, that silent presence, that boundary drawn without a single word. Why did it let me walk away? After that encounter, nothing was improvised anymore. Even without anyone sitting me down to explain rules, they began to reveal themselves clearly, almost like lessons always after I made a mistake. It was as if every misstep brought a silent warning. And it took me too long to realize I was being trained to respect limits I'd never had the right to cross. The first rule I learned was about direction. There were areas where I could move without feeling that weight in the air, and other places where just a few steps changed everything. The silence returned, the space seemed to close in, and my body reacted before my mind. It wasn't immediate fear. It was an internal alarm. Ignoring it once cost me an entire sleepless night, replaying every unnecessary step I'd taken. The second rule was about time. Certain parts of the day were clearly wrong for being there, not because of darkness or visibility, but because of activity. There were stretches when the woods felt too alive, too organized, like something was fully at work. When I insisted on staying during those times, the signs intensified, branches snapping in sequence, heavy footsteps in the distance, movement that didn't bother hiding. A clear message that I was in the wrong place at the wrong time. I also learned what not to carry. Metal drew attention in a way I hadn't expected. Overstuffed packs, unnecessary. Gear, anything that amplified my presence, seemed to trigger a reaction. When I stripped it down, carried only what I needed, the tolerance was greater. That's when I understood it wasn't only about physical territory, it was about impact. The more I interfered, the less welcome I became. Under no circumstances could I leave unnecessary traces. Trash, disturbed ground, any obvious mark of human passage seemed to be watched closely. Once, carelessly, I left something behind. Nothing important, nothing dangerous. The next day, I found it repositioned in a way that left no doubt. It had been seen, evaluated, and returned as a warning. It wasn't a threat. It was a correction. If you believe boundaries exist, even when no one speaks them out loud, comment respect, because that's what began forming there in the most uncomfortable way possible. Another major rule was about direct observation. Looking too hard wasn't tolerated. There was a clear difference between noticing a presence and staring. When I crossed that line, tension rose instant. Posture shifted. Movements became more visible. The environment reacted. I learned to lower my eyes at the right moment, not as submission, but as acknowledgement of space that wasn't mine. The biggest lesson, though, came when I tried to return to a place I'd assumed was neutral. It wasn't. It never was. I just hadn't understood that yet. When I pushed it, I found clear signs of a blockade, paths altered, obstacles freshly placed, marks. That made it obvious that area was outside the boundary. That's when I realized tolerance had very defined edges. It wasn't a wild intruder. It was a guardian, territorial, alert, protective, and human presence, mine included, even careful, was always right at the edge of what was acceptable. Every rule I learned reinforced that. I wasn't there by right. I was there by permission. I started adjusting my behavior with almost automatic precision. Less time, less movement, more attention. Every choice was shaped by what I'd learned the hard way. And even then, there was a constant feeling that one wrong move could cost far too much. Write boundary in the comments if you've ever realized too late that you crossed one, convinced you were still in control. The problem was, those rules didn't apply only to me. They existed whether I was there or not. And the more I understood them, the clearer it became that other people less careful, less aware, could cause irreversible damage simply because they didn't know those silent codes existed. The tension kept rising because I knew I wasn't the only one out there. I knew there was outside interest, growing curiosity, the urge to prove something, to record, to show. And I'd seen enough to understand that territory wouldn't react well to that. Not out of cruelty, but out of defense. Every rule carried an implied consequence. Respect meant continued tolerance. Ignoring meant provoking something I still hadn't seen in its full form. And, even doing everything right, I could feel how fragile the balance really was. Because rules don't exist just to be followed. They exist because someone at some point did exactly what they shouldn't have done. And while I adapted changing routes, learning not to cross certain lines, I was painfully aware that other people wouldn't have the same patience or caution. And that realization began preparing me, even before I wanted to admit it, for the next step, when it wouldn't be only about what I did or didn't do anymore, but what would happen when those rules were broken by someone who never even knew they existed. At some point, without me realizing it right away, this stopped being careful observation and started demanding involvement. There wasn't a conscious decision, no clear turning point. It was gradual, almost invisible, like when you adapt to a new environment, and only notice the change once you're already part of it. I still followed the rules, still kept my distance, still told myself it was temporary. But something in me couldn't pretend neutrality anymore. It started with a small detail, something that should have been irrelevant. A sound different from the others, shorter, sharper, coming from an area I'd already learned to avoid. It wasn't the kind of noise that signaled a direct threat, and it didn't match the earlier patterns. I hesitated. Any step off plan always came with consequences. Still, something about that sound didn't feel like a warning. It felt like need. When I got close enough to understand what was happening, I realized it wasn't a normal situation. Something was vulnerable, not in a human sense, but defenseless within that specific moment. The environment, which had always acted like natural protection, seemed insufficient. And the presence I already knew, usually distant, controlled, was too close now, but not aggressive. What happened next was quiet and precise. A calculated gesture, almost careful, it made it clear I wasn't dealing with brute force or instinct alone. There was intention. There was understanding of what was at stake. And it stripped away a last emotional barrier I'd been trying to keep. Because one thing is studying something unknown. Something entirely different is witnessing an act of protection. I wasn't blocked from being there. I wasn't driven off. If anything, my presence was tolerated in a different way, not as an intruder, but as a witness. And that carries weight. It creates responsibility. It pulls you into something you can't pretend you never saw. If you believe there are moments that change everything without a single word, comment, "I witnessed it," because that's exactly what happened to me. After that, the silent encounters carried a different meaning. They weren't just territorial evaluations anymore. There was recognition, small gestures that showed practical intelligence, paths indicated indirectly, warnings given before something dangerous unfolded, not as a favor, but as balance, a clear message that coexistence was possible if certain boundaries were respected. I started noticing behavior patterns that didn't fit any simple explanation. It wasn't only reaction to the environment, it was conscious adaptation, reading context, anticipating events, and all of it reinforced something I didn't want to admit out loud, not even to myself. I wasn't observing a rare animal. I was sharing space with something that understood far more than it should have. There was one specific moment, short, silent, when that empathy became impossible to deny. A shared stillness, no tension, no warning, just presence, no need to prove strength, no attempt to intimidate, just coexisting in that space for a few seconds that felt far too long to mean nothing. After that, I couldn't keep the emotional distance I'd planned. Every decision carried different weight. Staying out there wasn't just fulfilling an agreement. It was choosing to keep being part of something that could be destroyed so easily by human curiosity, greed, and the need to show off proof. Right, involved. In the comments, if you've ever felt yourself pass a point where you couldn't pretend you were just an observer anymore. I started worrying not only about what I was doing, but what others would do if they found out. I began anticipating risks, imagining scenarios, thinking through consequences that had never been part of my role. That wasn't in the original agreement. No one asked me to protect anything. But when you understand something exists, and how fragile it is in the face of human ignorance, neutrality becomes impossible. Every return carried a different kind of tension, not because of its presence, but because of the fear that something had changed while I was gone. Fear of finding the wrong signs, outside interference, traces that shouldn't be there. Fear that the balance had been broken, and I wouldn't be able to do anything about it. At the same time, a quiet trust was forming. Not explicit, not guaranteed, but real. More tolerance, controlled closeness, a lack of hostility that only holds when there's mutual understanding. It created a bond I never would have sought, but once it existed, it became impossible to ignore. I kept telling myself it was observation, study, monitoring. But deep down I knew I was too involved to pretend distance. I wasn't there to collect data anymore. I was there because, somehow, I'd been accepted in a space by something that didn't need me and still chose not to drive me away. If you're following this story right now, comment, keep going, because that bond, the one that felt quiet and stable, was exactly what made everything more dangerous later. Once it stopped being just research, every human mistake carried a much heavier weight, and I still had no idea how high the price would be for getting involved. After the bond formed, the sense of safety I thought I built started to crack, not because of its presence, but because of what started coming from the outside. Small human signs began appearing where there used to be nothing but isolation. Fresh tire tracks in places that rarely saw vehicles. Human footprints mixed into ground I knew too well not to notice. The remains of a fire put out in a hurry. None of that should have been there. At first, I tried to tell myself it was coincidence. Lost hikers, curious thrill seekers, people looking for a story to tell. But the more I watched, the clearer it became it wasn't random. There was interest, directed movement, and worse, persistence. Someone had noticed that area was hiding something out of the ordinary. Deep down, I knew the blame wasn't only theirs. My constant presence, even discreet, had left traces. No method stays invisible forever. The longer you stay in one place, the more you alter it. I'd been careful, but I wasn't perfect. And it only took that much for the wrong kind of attention to start closing in. Soon I caught distant, broken comments from people I barely knew. Conversations that stopped when I got close. Questions too vague to be innocent. People interested in reports, rumors, possibilities. And when someone starts assembling pieces without the full picture, the result is almost always destructive. Hunters started showing up more often. Not the traditional ones who know the land and respect certain lines, but the kind driven by challenge, by aggressive curiosity. Heavier gear, more invasive posture, eyes too alert for things that should have gone unnoticed. The woods reacted differently when they were around, and I could feel it before I even saw any physical sign. If you've ever realized the biggest danger almost always comes from other humans, comment threat, because that's exactly what started taking shape out there. Researchers showed up too, at least that's what they called themselves. People with technical language, scientific talk, elaborate justifications for being where they shouldn't be. They spoke of study, recording, discovery. But there was something wrong in the way they looked. It wasn't respect. It was ownership. The need to prove something at any cost. I tried to keep my distance, avoid contact, neither confirm nor deny anything. But the simple fact that I kept returning was enough to feed suspicion. Some started following from a distance. Others appeared at the same hours, like they were testing reactions. The tension grew every day. Authorities came later. Not officially, not with sirens or announcements. They arrived as questions, disguised visits, administrative interest, permits, maps, environmental records. Everything looked too normal, which made it even more dangerous. When the system starts moving, it doesn't stop easily. I began living in a constant state of alert. Every new human sign felt like one more step towards something irreversible. And the worst part was the clear awareness that I'd opened the door. My presence, my insistence, my involvement had turned a quiet territory into a point of interest. Write guilt in the comments if you understand the weight of realizing a choice you made put others at risk, even without meaning to. The woods reacted differently now. The balance I'd learned to respect was being pressured by outside forces. Warning signs became more frequent, more intense. They weren't aimed at me, but at what was approaching. And that made me even more uneasy, because I knew not everyone would read those warnings the way I did. I tried to discourage people indirectly. I said the area wasn't safe, that there was nothing there, that access was harder than it looked. But vague words don't compete with human curiosity once it's been awakened. The more I tried to contain it, the more it seemed to fuel it. There were nights I barely slept, imagining scenarios I couldn't control. Armed people stepping where they shouldn't, forced attempts to capture proof, unnecessary confrontations. The fear wasn't only about what could happen to me. It was about what could happen to something that never asked to be found. A sense of inevitability settled in, like I was watching a chain of events already in motion, unable to change its trajectory. Every new visitor, every new question, every new human mark in the dirt reinforced the feeling that something bad was closing in and fast. If you're still with me, comment, "I see it," because recognizing the signs before the disaster doesn't mean you can stop it. I measured every step with even more care, trying to minimize impact, trying to correct whatever I could. But there's a point where control slips away. When enough human desires converge on the same place, the land stops being a priority. It becomes a stage. And stages always demand a spectacle even if the cost is too high. The bond that once felt like a quiet bridge became a fragile point, threatened by forces that don't respect invisible boundaries. I felt like I was at the center of it all, not as the main character, but as the catalyst. And that awareness started weighing more than any physical fear. Every return came with a rising sense of urgency, like time was running out, like something needed to happen before it was too late, even if I didn't know what. The air felt heavier, the signs felt more direct, the tolerance felt shorter. And as more people moved in, drawn to what they never should have been looking for, I understood with painful clarity that the biggest threat wasn't what I'd been studying. It was us. And somehow, I'd helped set all of it in motion, without yet knowing what the final cost would be when that human threat finally crossed every last boundary. The price didn't come all at once. It didn't show up as one clear event you could point to. It built in layers, quietly, until it was impossible to pretend nothing had been lost. The first thing that disappeared, wasn't it? It was me, the version of me who believed in control and logic strong enough to contain any situation, in neutrality, as protection. That person stayed behind in that territory, even after I left physically. The disappearance happened without warning. No gradual shift, no goodbye, no explanation. Where there had once been presence, attention, silent answers, there was only emptiness. The woods were still there, but they weren't the same. The sounds returned unevenly, the patterns broke apart, and the delicate balance I'd learned to respect simply no longer existed. There were no clear tracks, no visible confrontation, just the certainty that something had been broken for good. Other losses came with it. People were affected, directly or indirectly, without fully understanding why. Some carried fear, some carried guilt. Someone paid a price that never should have been demanded, and I was left with silence. A silence heavier than any explicit threat, because it offers no defense, no repair. My life changed in a way that can't be undone after that. I changed routines. I changed routes. I changed choices. I learned to avoid certain places, certain topics, certain questions. I spent years measuring my words, revisiting memories, trying to figure out the exact moment everything slipped out of control. I never found a simple answer, because there wasn't one single mistake. There was a sequence of human decisions, each one defensible in the moment it was made. Trauma doesn't only show up as fear. Sometimes it shows up as awareness, as a constant understanding that not everything needs to be revealed, studied, or exposed. That there are forces, presences, and structures that function better beyond our reach. And that the human urge to dominate, record, and prove can be more destructive than anything we're trying to understand. I stayed silent for a long time because speaking wouldn't bring back what was lost. It wouldn't erase consequences. It wouldn't repair damage, but silence charges you anyway. It follows you, shapes your decisions, redraws your boundaries. I've never been able to look at the woods the same way again. I've never been able to hear certain sounds without feeling that old weight return. Write the word scar in the comments if you understand that some experiences don't go away. They just become something you learn to carry. Today, looking back on everything, I know the biggest mistake wasn't accepting the invitation, or staying too long, or learning the rules too late. The biggest mistake was believing humanity would know how to handle it. Believing curiosity would come with respect. Believing discovery wouldn't turn into exploitation. Believing presence wouldn't become threat. Some things don't disappear because they want to. They disappear because they have to. Because staying would mean exposing themselves to a kind of violence that doesn't leave visible marks, but destroys all the same. and accepting that is uncomfortable because it forces us to recognize our limits as a species. This story ends here, but what it reveals doesn't. Repeats in different contexts, under different names, in different places. Every time someone crosses a boundary, believing they have the right to be there. Every time something too old for us is treated like an object of study instead of an independent existence. On the screen right now, there's another video showing up. It's not about this same event, and it's not about this same situation, but it touches something that connects on a deeper level than it seems at first. Another perspective, another setting, another secret that stayed buried for too long. If you want to keep thinking about what happens when invisible boundaries get ignored, that next video will take you down a different path, but it will stay with you just the same. Some stories don't connect through the facts. They connect through the consequences.